Dundee in Scotland and ends in the lighthouses of Tasmania. Please welcome Alyssa.
It feels really vacant with this little empty spot. Does anyone come down? Thank you. It's so great to see familiar faces in the crowd, because last time I did this, I was all Shane's family and I didn't know anyone. So I've been exploring the idea of belonging through looking at my ancestry. So has anyone ever been on to ancestry.com or one of those things? Who's done that? And what have you discovered about your family? Where are you from?
I found out that my great-great-grandfather, or possibly great-great-great-grandfather, spent time in a jail in New South Wales.
Wow, that's interesting. Anyone else? Where are your family from? Yeah.
I discovered that my great-great-grandmother hopped on a boat as a refugee while she was pregnant.
Wow.
My great-great-great-grandfather came out on the second ship to WA and they ran aground at Rockingham. The ship was called Rockingham.
Wow, there you go. Yeah.
Great-great-great-grandfather was a juvenile delinquent who came to the Swan River colony.
We share that in common. So in my explorations, I've learned a lot about my family history. And what I've explored mostly is where they're from and when they arrived. The very first arrival I can find in my family line on both sides is 1792. If you do the maths, that's only 4 years after Australia was colonised. But this is Noongar land. This is not my land. But my family came from elsewhere, so do I belong here? Because I'm feeling like I don't belong here. This is not my land. Last year I went to Scotland and on both sides of my family, both mum and dad, they've got Scottish ancestry and they came from this very similar area actually, if you track it right back. And as soon as I got up into the Highlands, I felt this overwhelming connection to the land of Scotland. Who else has connections to Scotland in their family? Yeah, it's nearly like a third of people in the room. So if I'd have said to a Scottish person when I was there, you know, oh, my family comes from Scotland, they would say, join the other 40 million. 40 million people around the world recognise that Scotland is a place of their ancestral home. But we can't have 40 million people moving to Scotland to find their belonging. That's not going to work. So where do we then find belonging? Where do I find my belonging? My family I'm 7th generation Australian. 7th generation Tasmanian, if I want to be really technical. My daughter's father was a migrant. They're 2nd generation Australians on their dad's side, 8th generation on my side. How long does it take for people to belong to a land? How many generations have to pass before they belong to a land? Scots and Irish, which is where the majority of my family are, were displaced people. The Highlanders were swept up and put onto other places. They were taken out of the Highlands. They were displaced from their land. The Irish were used as slaves and also displaced from their land. I'm an ancestor. I'm descendant of displaced people. In my family line, there's at least 6 convicts. 6. One of them was sent out to Australia 7 years for stealing cheese. Cheese. He had a really tough life and his children ended up in an orphanage in Hobart. I just sit with this wonder of belonging. You know, he was displaced. Once the convicts were sent out, they weren't allowed back. There was no going home for those people, so they had to make the most of it when they arrived. One particular line of interest that I'm interested in is that of my great-great-grandfather, who came out from Dundee. And the reason I'm interested in him is because when I was in Scotland, I actually went to Dundee. I went to the street, 64 Constable Lane, the exact place where he was born. And I tried to find some connection to this man who ended up coming to Australia. His father was a sailor. I can't track any further back than his father. And his name is William Muir. And I don't know if you know much about Scottish names, but Muir is a very, very common name. And so is William. So I can't track any further. So he was a sailor, and my great-great-grandfather was born in that street. Now there's a big hotel there, but I imagine at the time there would have been a beautiful little cottage where he was born into the arms of his grandmother. His grandmother signed his birth at the birth registry with a cross. And he had a couple of other siblings. But from where he lived, he turned around and he could see the river. A river that went across this bay. It was just a beautiful place to grow up. His name was William Jenkins Muir. And when he was 12, he was orphaned. I imagine he lived with his grandmother, who lived to a ripe old age of 88. Yay! So imagine he lived with her. But when he was about 19, he jumped on a ship in Liverpool, spent 80 days at sea, and arrived in Sydney. When he arrived, he started working on ships as a seaman, just like his father. He was only 19. And for the way that the sea travel went in those days, he ended up in Hobart, working on ships in Hobart, where he met my great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Duncan, another Scot, the child of a Scot and an Irishman. Her parents, her father was a shipbuilder, and they lived on the wharf in Hobart. And so he lived on the waters too. And Hobart, I don't know if anyone's been to Hobart, it's a beautiful river city where I was born. William Jenkins Muir worked very hard in his shipping life, but then he decided to work in lighthouses. He got posts from New Zealand, New South Wales, Tasmania, all over Tasmania. He got many, many posts. And when he went away, sometime he'd take his wife and children with him. My great-grandfather, who I met as a child, he went and lived when he was about 4 on Matsyker Island. And he grew up there. Can you imagine what it would be like to be a child on an island in the middle of the ocean and not have any other kids to play with, not to be able to have to be inside all the time because of the weather? It would have been really challenging. But he remembers that time. He remembered it when I remember talking to him. So William Jenkins Muir went out onto the islands quite regularly, sometimes with his family, sometimes alone. Sometimes he would go for months on end by himself. One time, he went out onto one of the islands in the Great Southern Ocean. I don't know if you know much about the Great Southern Ocean, but it's not a very pleasant place to be in winter. Heaving oceans, fogs that just roll in, making everything, your vision is blinded. He went out to this island and he was staying for 3 months. He didn't have his family with him. And he arrived in the jetty, and they had to just navigate the weather before they got there. It was not always easy to get the boats into the jetty because of the rocks and the waves and the jutting pieces of rock out in the ocean. But they got in, they unloaded him and all his stuff. The Lighthouse Keeper swapped over, and William Jenkins Muir was there on the lighthouse. It was his turn. 3 months, all by himself. He spent that afternoon walking up the hill, taking all of his provisions up to the cottage, which was next to the lighthouse, where he would spend home for the next few months. On his first night there, a big storm blew up, and he was trapped inside, and the only thing he could do was to go outside, the little distance between the cottage and the lighthouse, go up the winding stairs to the top, trim the wick, light the candle, polish the windows, make sure the lighthouse was working properly, and then he'd go back in, read a book, make some notes, make some observations. And that's how he spent his first 3 nights on the island. He didn't even know what it looked like. He'd never been outside of it really, apart from his unloading. And when the weather finally cleared after 3 days, he went outside. He walked across the island. It was rocky and there's some shrubbery. Exploring, he looked out to sea, to see distant ships. And he found that he really enjoyed this island. It was good. He thought, I feel like fish. And he went down to the jetty with his fishing rod, and he was just about to cast the line, and he saw something in the water, tangled in the great giant kelp. Have you seen the giant kelp of Tasmania? Really thick, wild kelp. And he thought, oh, what's that? And he went down and he saw it was a juvenile seal, and he lifted it up. It looked injured, so he took it back up to the cottage and placed her gently on the bed. And he just checked her over for injuries, made sure she was all right. He had a little bit of dried fish, so he gave her a bit of dried fish. And then he had to go and light the lighthouse again. So he went up the stairs, lit the lighthouse, came back down. When he came back, he heard the seal had jumped off the bed and was just sort of looking a little bit better. So he gave her a bit more fish. And that's how they spent most of the rest of the day. But he got a bit bored in those stormy nights, and Elizabeth Duncan, his wife, had packed him he packed his bag for him. She put in some slippers, but she put in 3 slippers, a reason he could never figure out. So William got out the slippers and thought, I'll see what